to the third Dean's Lecture of 2017. Before I begin, I would like to acknowledge the elders, families and descendants of the Wurundjeri people who've been custodians of these lands for many generations. I acknowledge that the land on which we meet today was the place of age-old ceremonies of celebration, initiation and renewal, and that the local Aboriginal peoples have had and continue to have a unique role in the life of this university. So tonight, we welcome our Professor of Science Education, Jan van Driel, to present not just a Dean's Lecture, but his inaugural professorial address at the University of Melbourne. It's an important occasion. Jan was a chemistry teacher in both secondary schools and universities. He completed his PhD in chemical education at Utrecht University in the Netherlands in 1990. I don't know if you wanted that detail to be still. Following that, he worked as an education consultant, teacher trainer and researcher at Delft University of Technology before joining Leiden University Graduate School of Teaching in 1995. His focus has been on teacher education and preparing students to teach in upper secondary education. With that focus, he went on to become the Professor of Science Education in 2006 and Director of ICLON Leiden University in 2010. Jan's a world-leading scholar. His work is influential in informing the professional development of science teachers, and he's done extensive research in the domains of teaching, teacher education and higher education. He's supervised over 30 PhD candidates to completion. Jan's also co-editor-in-chief of the International Journal of Science Education and was Vice President of the Netherlands Educational Research Association from 2001 to 2009, which is quite a stint. Until recently, Jan was chair of the Inter-University Centre for Teacher Education and secretary of the board of Technasium Foundation in the Netherlands. He joined our graduate school in August 2016, and it really is such a pleasure to have him present tonight's lecture on the opportunities and obstacles for STEM education. I've asked my colleague, Professor David Clark, who many of you know, the Director of the International Centre for Classroom Research, to move a vote of thanks at the conclusion of this lecture. Please join me in welcoming Jan to the lectern.
True, this is my inaugural speech in Melbourne, but in 2008 I gave an inaugural speech at the University of Leiden. I was also there the first Professor of Science Education in the history, and the history, if you can read the very small print, goes back to 1575. And maybe because of that history it looks a bit differently there than it looks here. It's a bit of a formal session, and the speech itself is delivered in a church from the 15th century. In that speech, I look back at my work as a chemistry teacher, as Leslie just recalled, who did a PhD in chemistry teaching, and during that PhD, I became more and more interested in teachers and teaching and how teachers develop their professional repertoire during pre-service teacher education, but also during their work, for instance, when they're implementing a new curriculum. I developed a particular interest in pedagogical content knowledge, PCK, as the knowledge that teachers develop and apply to promote student learning of content. I finished that speech by outlining a research agenda that would shape my research in the following decade, that is the past 10 years. And in this research, the focus continued to be on teachers and teaching, but it was broadened. More often in studies, students were actually included, and student learning, and I extended my research also to the domain others than science and to higher or tertiary education. I didn't mention STEM in 2008, nor a Dutch equivalent, simply because it didn't exist at the time, at least not in my country. Nobody talked about it. STEM has since become a buzzword, a word in the last decade, also in Australia, and in the last 5 years in particular. The question what STEM is and how it relates to STEM education doesn't have a straightforward answer. In her PhD study, Anne Osman, who's here in the room, Welcome, Anne. She is tracing the origins of STEM and STEM education in Australia and elsewhere, but she's only just started, and at this stage she and her supervisors, me and Professor David Clark, are often more confused than enlightened. I will present and critique an operational definition of STEM later on in this talk. Nevertheless, there are many reports in Australia about STEM and STEM education, and they all stress how important STEM education is, or at least should be. The question, of course, is why? Well, one answer maybe is related to this. You will remember, of course, that in October of last year, the results of PISA and TIMSS came out just very close to each other. The results were also quite similar, and the media reported widely about the disappointing results of Australia, the scores, and since the scores are to a large extent based on achievement in science and maths, not for PISA, but certainly for TIMSS, there was a strong call to improve education in these areas. But why? Just to get in the top 5 of the world? You do have, I must say, it's an observation I made since I got here, there is a bit of an obsession with rankings in this country. Just before this, I was at a meeting where we were discussing with people from other faculties the world ranking of, the global ranking of universities, and just recently today or earlier today, the ARVU ranking, the Shanghai ranking came out, and we were happy because the University of Melbourne went up from 40 to 39, so we're in the top 40, and even better, ANU had gone down 20 places. Well, it's clearly something that you appreciate. You like rankings. Of course, seriously, mostly STEM or STEM education is discussed and emphasized in relation to economics factors. This is just one quote out of many. This is a PricewaterhouseCoopers report that some of you may know, but there are many more. And from this point of view, of course, it is rather alarming that the number of students choosing STEM subjects are declining, particularly in the areas of advanced math, physics, and computer science, and even more among female students. I will get back to that in a little while. I never know how they make these calculations, but there must be very sophisticated models to do it. Same for this one. It's actually the most dominating argument that you find in all those reports. Students need STEM skills, STEM-based skills. Skills are required for future jobs. Again, this is one quote of the Federation of Young Australians put out a report just last week that had very similar messages. The argumentation always relates to the impact of automation and artificial intelligence, which impacts almost every profession. It makes some jobs almost redundant, and it will also lead to the emergence of new jobs that we don't know yet. Industry 4.0 is something that's mentioned, and there was a seminar about that last week, I believe. So STEM-based skills, the emphasis is very strongly on the skills. What are these skills? What kind of skills are we talking about? Now, this is probably a bit difficult to read, but I'll talk you through it. Who better to ask than employers? Employers are looking for skills. They want, when they select graduates, they are particularly interested in certain skills. This graph comes from a survey that was done under the Australian Association of Graduate Employers last year. And you'll see that, and I'll highlight some of the outcomes. The ones on top, and the one that I've masked is actually called cultural fit. That scored the highest of all. Below that, teamwork, interpersonal skills. I think I have something to point that out. Teamwork, interpersonal skills, oral communication, and problem-solving skills. They all score 60 to 70%. Whereas down here, university grades are rather down at the ladder, and only 15%. It's interesting that these skills are so important. I was thinking, is that because in Australia, because you are so competitive, people are not very good at collaboration or communication? Or is this a reflection of the relatively small number of females in STEM jobs? I don't know. Throughout this talk, I will address a couple of what I would call misconceptions about STEM education. And when I did my PhD in the 1980s, there was a lot of research on misconceptions, and there was a lot of discussion, and Peter Fensham here in the room will remember that very well, of whether we should call that alternative conceptions or preconceptions. Misconceptions, that was not so nice, but I really prefer the term misconceptions, and I'll tell you why. This is one of them. The emphasis on skills. It almost goes to the point, and quite a few publications, and this one quote again, illustrate that it seems that skills is all you need, or skills are all you need. And I think that's taking things a bit too far. Suppose, for instance, that students are asked to solve a problem about black holes, or climate change, or gene technology. True, they can get all the information they need from the internet. But if you ask them to apply that information, to apply their problem-solving skills to that information, they won't get anywhere unless they can really make sense of that information. First of all, is the information they found valid and reliable? How do you know? How can you be sure? Also, second, how can you get your head around that information, especially when we talk about these rather complicated and abstract topics? They're not so easy to understand, depending, of course, on the age and the level of the students, but they're quite difficult to grasp. My point is that skills are important, but they're not worth very much unless they are well connected and embedded in knowledge or understanding. And I go on a little bit about this because I know from experience that the belief in skills, or the emphasis on skills, if you take that too far, especially when people talk about transferable skills, this is really dangerous. Not too long ago in the Netherlands, our version of what you call TAFE underwent a national complete haul-over, a complete remake, because it was inspired by talks with employers who said, what we need is skills. Instead of skills, it was called competencies. Generic competencies dominated the curriculum, and teachers were hired, and one of my friends was one of them, with a solid background in geography and IT. He said, we're not interested in that. Which skills can you teach? This was implemented on a national scale, and we're talking about hundreds and thousands of students. It was a complete disaster. And now those schools, those TAFE schools, are very busy in re-establishing the balance between the domains, the knowledge that they're teaching, the understanding of that, and the skills. But skills dominate the agenda. This is a quote I'll let you read from the EU last year. There's slightly different skills compared to the Australian employers. Problem solving always comes up, critical thinking, entrepreneurship, collaboration and communication is probably something we can in Europe, I don't know. The question then for me is, and you saw that in the European slide, just to go back, they call it the new skills agenda. Other people have talked about the 21st century skills or the soft skills. Are they STEM skills? No, not really. All of those things that you just saw, critical thinking or collaboration, can be taught and learned in the context of other topics and subject areas as well. However, STEM education might be a good vehicle to promote the development of particular skills. And that brings me to look at your curriculum, that is the Victorian curriculum, I should say my curriculum, because I live here and work here. Just a few examples how, for instance, critical and creative thinking is formulated in the Victorian curriculum for year 7-8 and year 9-10. There's much more, but I took these three. I'm quite impressed when I first read this, and I think that if you take this literally, this means that if kids can really do this at the end of 7-8 or 9-10, I'm most impressed. I mean, the current president of the United States is... well, he may be able to do it, but he doesn't show it. There's a lot of work on critical thinking, has been going on for quite a while, and it has a long tradition. There's a lot of instruments, and together with colleagues from science, Professor Roel Mulder, and art, Tim van Gelder, we are currently considering instruments to do a project in which we will assess the critical thinking skills of undergraduates in science and how these develop during their study. One of the instruments that we're looking at has questions like this, and I'll give you a minute to think about it, and it's multiple choice, and it's quite straightforward. You may talk with your neighbor. Who says yes? Anybody dare to put up their hands to say yes? No. Peter? Yes. One person, yes. Probably the oldest person in the room. And I mean that as a compliment.
The wisest.
Anybody know? So everybody see? Okay. Can anyone explain? Yes, please?
We don't have the necessary information to work out.
Okay. I would say yes. And I'll explain. We don't know what Anne's status is, but Anne can only be two things, married or unmarried. If you take that as a clue, Jack is looking at Anne. If she's unmarried, then it's yes. If Anne is married, it's also yes. Is this critical thinking? Well, going back to the Victorian curriculum, I think it relates to the first description that you find here, because that's what you do, of course. And when I first saw it, I also said C, just like you, because you think you don't have enough information. Actually, you have to rethink about your own thinking. And that's probably what you do here. However, and taking it another step further, when I did this recently with a group of teachers from one of our UMNOS networks, and I know that Kath Henderson was in the room, one of them said, well, actually, you can't tell, because Anne may be a cat. It doesn't say that Anne's a woman. So that's what I call critical thinking. Another group of teachers where I did this, primary teachers, about a month ago, a lady in that room, one of the primary teachers, said, yes, okay, but why is Jack looking at Anne? And again, I would say that's critical thinking. It also illustrates something that we do in education and in assessment in particular. We present problems without any context. And we ask students to respond to them, and it's usually right or wrong. And actually to think about why do we talk about these issues is, I think, and it's quite relevant when we talk about STEM education. So I would like to continue to talk about STEM education from the point of view of education, not economy, but looking at it from an education perspective, and particularly, given my own background, from a science education perspective. And I would say STEM education definitely has certain promises to address problems that have been dominating science education for quite some time. In my inaugural speech back in 2008 in Leiden, I summarized these problems along three strands. They're summarized here too, and I'm afraid that most of these, if not all, are still apply. They still exist. Curricula all over the world. What happened, of course, is that starting in the 19th century, more and more knowledge was developed in science, and what happened in most curricula is that we tried to cram that into curriculum without taking enough out, and a lot of science curricula are completely overloaded with knowledge, which leads to a mile wide and an inch deep approach in many cases. It also leads to the point that we tend to present as much information or knowledge as we can as answers. The questions that originally underlined or underpinned the research that led to this information, to this knowledge, is very rarely addressed. When I did my PhD, I went back to school books of the early 20th century and was surprised to see that the same topics were addressed. There was much more time to talk about it. And they were actually much better when we now talk about inquiry teaching, inquiry-based teaching. They addressed the questions much more, whereas modern school books just gave the information straightforward. Another problem, and it may be related, of course, is attitudes towards science education. There's been a lot of research on attitudes all over the world, and it's different in different countries, but especially in some of the Western countries in Europe, Australia, the US, there is a problem with attitudes, and particularly among girls. Together with colleagues from MGSC, Christine Redmond, Victoria Miller and Cheryl Jacob, and colleagues from Deakin University, led by Professor Russell Teitler, we're doing a project at the moment sponsored by the Inver Gowrie Foundation, focusing on how to increase the participation of females in STEM, both in school and in work and jobs. And one obvious thing, of course, is that STEM is not one thing. In life and health sciences, biology, medicine, female students outnumber males. The trouble is more towards the physical sciences, the mathematics, the computer sciences. And the question, of course, is how to attract female students to these male-dominated areas in an environment where parents, teachers, and everybody basically gives them the message from a very young age that these areas are not for them. And also, yeah, that comes with a lack of role models. The third option, the third strand of problems in science education has to do with the quality of teachers. Of course, it's well known that teachers have an enormous impact on the more than any other educational variable on the learning of students. The work of our colleague John Hattie demonstrates that over and over, among many others. The reality, of course, is that particularly primary teachers, they lack confidence and competence in science, to teach science. And in many countries, including Australia, but also the Netherlands, there is a shortage of qualified teachers, particularly in maths and physics. And we know that when those subjects are taught by teachers who are not very strong in the disciplines, it often leads to a rather poor version of teaching maths and physics, which could lead back to the negative attitudes of students. Of course, there have been solutions to these problems, and they've been tried all over the world, some for many times, and some more successful than others. Of course, to add modern science content, because we don't want to only teach 19th century stuff about acids and bases in chemistry. You also want to teach about the modern insights in chemistry and nanotechnology and biochemistry that happens. And some good examples of introducing modern content in science curricula have been developed here not too long ago in Australia, for instance, the Ramstep project. There's been a lot of attempts to teach science from the perspective that not everybody's going to be a scientist, but everybody needs some understanding of science, public understanding. Of course, there have been examples where instead of a monodisciplinary approach, integrated approaches to teaching science, and also the rise of informal science education must be mentioned here. These are curricular initiatives. There's also a lot of pedagogical approaches have been tried, and again, some more successfully than others. Conceptual change was the approach to help students to develop their alternative or preconceptions or misconceptions. And it's can be a powerful approach that I did some work back in my days of my PhD. Variations of inquiry-based, project-based, or context-based ways to teach science. Actually, all of them with the same idea, that is to make science more relevant, to make connections between the science that is taught and the world that students actually live in. Going back to STEM education, if we know all this, we know these problems and we know some of these solutions, and I'm very happy that Peter Fensham is here. I hope you don't mind that I refer to you, but last year in October there was a meeting at Deakin University about STEM education. You gave a talk and said, well, actually we've tried all these things. They didn't work all that well in science. The problem still persists, so why would STEM education be more successful? I think this is a good time in the talk to start to look at what STEM education could be. This is a quote and I'll let you read it from Carla Johnson, an American STEM educator in the magazine or the journal School Science and Mathematics. And I'll like to comment on this definition in two parts. The first thing I would like to comment on is the integrated, the word integrated in this definition. Well, I would say there's another misconception here. This is something that my colleague David Clark, who I already mentioned, and I have had a lot of discussions since we first met about STEM education, about interdisciplinary, is it cross or multidisciplinary, or is it integration? And David can put these things much better in words than I can, so I'll give you two of his quotes from a recent talk he gave at a mathematics education conference. And maybe these sentiments resonate stronger even with the maths education community than with the science education community. Some say because it's the M at the end, it feels the mathematicians fear that they will be dominated by science or technology and engineering and reduced to like a toolkit for those other disciplines. Whether that's true or not is not so much the point. I do agree, and I can't formulate it as beautifully as David can. I do agree, being a chemist, that the disciplines have their own specific nature, their own specific knowledge and understanding. And when we talk about STEM as an integration of all of that, I think we don't do the disciplines justice. And I don't also think that that's something we should do in our curriculum. Going back to the definition that I showed before, the second part I think is what I am a bit more enthusiastic about. Particularly the notion of those practices. The infusion of practices from scientific inquiry, technological and engineering design, and mathematical analysis. And the skills. I think this is an area, this is a definition that I'd like to elaborate a little bit on. Because what could bring STEM together? How could we bring STEM together if we, like I would suggest, if we respect the integrity of the disciplines? We could then look at what are those core practices? What are things that scientists, mathematicians do that are reasonably the same, even though they use different language, they use different knowledge? I would say in science and math that's research. And there's a couple of verbs, there could be other verbs, but I think explaining and analyzing, predicting are among the key activities you do when you do research. And in technology and engineering, I would say the key core activity is design. And design includes creating, it creates problem solving, optimizing. Very often it's not one problem that has one answer, it is seeking an optimal solution among other solutions. And to put it even more compact, I would say the essence of research is that the answer is unknown. It's something that you do and you don't know what you're going to find. And for STEM education, this is quite a shift, because what we usually do, especially in science education, is we ask the students to measure the pH of a buffer that was carefully prepared by the lab tech. The answer is already known. Studying the pH of a range of water samples from, for instance, the river that runs along the school, that's a different thing. That's already much closer to research. Design, I would say, a characteristic is there's always more than one answer. And again, that's different. When we have students to solve problems in school, it's usually there's one answer is right, and the rest is wrong. And research and design are not different worlds altogether. We talk about R&D for a long time, of course, suggesting that research and design are interlinked practices. And this is just one graph, just one scheme visualization to show how those links, what they might look like. Both design and research or investigate have their own specific cycles. Again, we could talk about the labels, but that's not so interesting. What I find here, what I want to illustrate is that in the course of a design process, for instance, developing a new car, you may need to do research to test or to investigate the qualities of some of the materials. And while doing a research project, it may very well be that you need to develop or design and test an instrument, for instance, to measure some of the outcome variables. So research and design in practice are very strongly connected. And this idea was at the basis of an innovation in the Netherlands that started about 15 years ago, 12, 15 years ago. And I was lucky to be part of this in the last 5 years as a board member. It started actually by two parents who were not happy with the science education that their daughters were getting at school. They started conversations at the school, and the school at some point decided to change their curriculum and implement a new subject called research and design in the curriculum. Other schools in the neighborhood were interested, and so initially there was a network of 5 schools implementing this new subject. They introduced it alongside the traditional disciplines, not to replace it, but they did it from year 7 to year 12. And of course they needed time. So for instance, if you teach research and design for 4 weeks, you cannot just add it to what's already on the timetable. So there were other hours. There were hours were taken out of 1 hour of math, 1 hour of science, 1 hour of arts were taken out to make space for this new subject. Characteristics of this subject is that it is project-based, so students work in teams on projects. The projects are negotiated with parties external to the school, and the teachers also work together in multidisciplinary teams. The teacher of mathematics, for instance, who 1 hour of his or her maths lessons was now devoted to research and design, that same teacher may still be teaching together with the other teachers to supervise the student projects. The projects can be anything and very dependent on the local situation, the local industries that the school works with. This is just one example of a project where a local food industry produced a lot of carrot skin as waste. They were processing carrot, and they asked the students, so this project was, what can you do with those carrot skins, if anything? And the project led to the idea that the carrots can be compressed, and I don't know exactly how they do it, that's not the point, but they could be applied in floorboards. And it doesn't go as far that the students actually got the patent, but it was a very successful project. I mean, as I said, the projects are very wide in range. This is an interesting example from an innovation point of view, because it is completely bottom-up. One school started, parents started, one school started, 5 schools. In the last 10 years, it has grown to 93 schools all over the country. That's, I would say, a significant measure of impact. Schools have established relationships with local industries, local councils, but also with institutes for higher education. And the government has followed it. Very different from other innovations in my country, the one that I just mentioned, that was a disaster. This one was followed with interest. It was not funded. At some point, the government said, yes, research and design can be an elective in the curriculum. Other schools can also offer it. You can examine it in year 12. The Netherlands has a system where 50% of the subjects are examined in a national test, and the other 50% is examined by the school. This is part of school examination. And for teachers, there is a certification process where teachers, to teach research and design, they need to go through a training process and obtain a certificate which is recognized by the government. So being a board member in the last 5 years, I was quite enthusiastic about that example. Also, however, we really don't know all that well what the impact is. I mean, it's nice that it grows, but the real impact, there's not much research actually going on to investigate the effects on the students or the teachers. I also use this example to illustrate a couple of other potential misconceptions about STEM education. In this example, the timetable was reorganized, and that could be a big challenge for schools if they want to go that way. However, it's not really necessary to do that. There's other ways to, if you want to work across the boundaries of certain subjects, you can start small. You can say, well, let's in term 3 of year 8 combine 2 hours of maths with 2 hours in biology and teach biomaths, for instance, for 1 term, and see how that goes, and have the biology and the maths teachers work together without changing the timetable. Schools in the Technasium project are all required to have a studio or a workplace where students can actually build and work on their project. However, that doesn't imply that every school needs to have the latest technology inside. I know that some schools in Victoria do, and it's amazing. If you have 3D printers or virtual reality or robotics, great. But you can do fantastic STEM education with just studying the growth of plants around the school, or insects, or water quality, or what have you. And finally, again, in this project, R&D is taught in a project-based manner, and that seems to make sense when you want STEM education to be connected with the real world. But of course, it doesn't have to be all project-based. Actually, that's quite risky. We know from the research in cognitive load, for instance, that there's always needs to be a balance between structure and openness in education. There's nothing wrong with giving direct instruction about certain knowledge, certain content, and have the students work on projects the next day, for instance. Pedagogies, and of course, emphasize the role of the teacher, and that balance between openness and structure is very much the domain of the teacher, who should know, and who definitely a good teacher knows when the kids need more structure and when an explanation is needed and when they can work independently. I already mentioned the central role of teachers. This is two other quotes. I like them both. The Fullen one is very strong. And when we talk about educational change, yes, it is as simple and complex as it is, that you need to know, you are dependent on what teachers do and think. This relates to a lot of the research that I've done in the past 20 years in Leiden with my colleagues and PhD students. There's many models of teacher change. This is an older one. It was quite prominent. It starts from the point that whenever there's an innovation, teachers need to undergo staff development or professional development. Teachers need to learn something. That is then supposed to lead to changes in classroom practice. Where teachers adapt or apply the new behavior, which then ultimately leads to student learning outcomes, whatever the project or the innovation aims at, and ultimately in changes in teachers' beliefs and attitudes. I don't think it works this way. The assumption is that teachers are deficient, that if there is an innovation, that teachers do not know how to do it, and we will teach them that, and then they can do it. A lot of the research that I did, and that my students, for instance, did in Leiden, has looked at teachers' beliefs, teachers' values, teachers' knowledge and goals at the start of innovation projects. For instance, about 10 years ago, there was an introduction of a nationwide introduction of a context-based curriculum for chemistry education, in secondary chemistry education, and I conducted a survey among 1,000, it's the whole population, 1,000 chemistry teachers in the country, to find that to investigate their curriculum beliefs, finding that they had very distinct belief profiles, and that was very different from that they either favored or rejected the innovation. And those belief profiles are very important to know when you want the innovation to connect with what teachers actually think and do and value. If you do not do that, there's a fair chance that the innovation completely fails. So this idea has been the basis of a lot of the research that we were doing in Leiden. And I'll just give you here four of my PhD students. I can't, of course, do them justice by summarizing their thesis in one sentence. I'm very well aware of that. But just to give you a brief sense, the first person, Ineke Henze, looked at the development of teachers' PCK, pedagogical content knowledge, when there was a public understanding of science curriculum was introduced in the Netherlands. And she found that she found two very different different ways of development of pedagogical content knowledge. Dirk Wongso-Pawiro, in another study, looked at science and math teachers in the context of a year-long professional development program. And he used the model that was developed by David Clark and Hilary Hollingsworth at this university to find that teachers who reflect on student learning, on the effects of the innovation on students, had a very different pattern and a much more sustained development of their knowledge, leading also to sustained changes in practice compared to teachers who were not so well focused on student learning. Michiel Dam looked at teachers' hierarchical goal systems developed a technique with his other supervisors to elicit those goal systems and use that to help teachers to implement a context-based biology curriculum, looking at what are the things that teachers were already good at and also the things that teachers already valued in their teaching. Rather than saying, well, you've been teaching traditionally until now, let's change to a context-based way of teaching. And finally, Monica Laus defended her thesis last year. She looked at what is it that in the context of innovation teachers want to learn themselves? What are their learning goals? How do they want to learn? And why do they want to learn certain things? Finding that very often, contrary to the goals of an innovation at the school level, teachers are very interested in learning about their subject matter or teaching their subject matter, of course. And those goals are very important when you look at the way they want to learn. So going back to STEM education and how it might be implemented, I would say without, this is something I think that schools can do, and I know that some schools in Victoria are already doing things like this. I would say, I call it a design team-based approach. And design and team are important here. Teams of teachers, because I do believe that STEM can be successful, can only be successful if we make connections between the disciplines without demolishing them. So take topics from the curriculum and look at the skills. The skills are important. And the skills are in the curriculum. Which skills fit well with which topics? How can we teach problem solving in Year 9? Which topic from biology lends itself very well to that? And can we teach problem solving in biology in Term 3 in a way that the physics teacher or the maths teacher in Term 4 can follow up on? So talk about teaching and assessing, of course, skills in a very explicit way, because that's very often not what we do. Also, of course, to give students feedback on the development of their skills, also of their knowledge, also of their attitude, but skills. So that's again is something that's not always very common in schools, and it has to do, of course, with making those skills explicit and being able to assessing them without grading, without ranking, without another competition, but monitoring the development of skills and giving feedback on that. And I think it makes the innovation more powerful if teachers collect data in their own classroom. What are students learning? How are they responding? How are they working? You could do that in all sorts of ways, collect students' work, for instance, or record students' discussions, and bring that back to the team. Report what students are doing, and making decisions about that, about further adjustments of the curriculum. And professional learning, of course, should be part of that. There have been there's a strong belief in, especially in the United States, in professional learning communities. Well, professional learning communities, if they only exist about a group of teachers from one school, it may not be all that effective. You probably need at some point output from somebody else. That can be a colleague from another school, but of course that can also be an expert from a university or somebody from an industry. That could be done at the start of the project. That could be done throughout the project, but it needs to be fit for purpose. It needs to fit the innovation. So, how can STEM education make a difference in Australia? There's a lot happening in Australia, in Victoria, but in Australia, it's. Just recently, the chief scientist launched what I think he calls a STAR portal. If you go there, the website, you'll find over 250 initiatives around STEM education. What you don't find is a national coherent vision what STEM education is or what it should be. And I think that's exactly what is lacking. I quote here a report that appeared a couple of years ago, written by Simon Marginson, who I think at that time worked at this university, and Russell Tytler and Freeman and Roberts. A report that looks at how STEM is implemented in a range of countries. And I think this quote says quite a bit. STEM-strong countries, countries where STEM is implemented successfully, that is, a lot of students are interested in STEM, pursue STEM, the achievement in STEM is good. They do things that Australia could learn from. In the Netherlands, for instance, there was there was one of those agency, a funding body that was created about 12 years ago by the national government and funded directly by the Ministry of Education. And that institute has funded a lot of initiatives around STEM education for primary, secondary education, tertiary education, projects with schools, projects aimed at girls. It has been quite successful. The numbers of students in STEM subjects in the Netherlands have increased substantially. There are many more girls in STEM subjects in schools and universities than there were before. The enrollment in engineering, for instance, in the Netherlands has almost doubled in the last 10 years. I'll say a few more words about it, but I think what Australia really needs is a national concerted effort. So not just a list of a lot of initiatives, but a vision, and a vision that also is connected to a funding policy. You need to invest. Going back to the start of my talk, if 1% more of students has such economical benefits, it's not so strange that you put some money in the development of STEM education. It needs to create opportunities for schools, the design team-based approaches. I really believe that is a very powerful approach, but it needs funding, it needs time. Teachers need to be released to actually do that work. And that includes professional opportunities for professional learning, as I said. It also, I think, is important to create partnerships that link STEM activities in schools with vocational higher education industries. I know, again, a lot of these things are happening, but a lot of what's happening here is short-term, local, and not sustained. And what's missing, and that's not unique to Australia, that's missing almost everywhere, is a research agenda that actually monitors and investigates what the effects of all these initiatives are. When I just said that the numbers in the Netherlands of students have gone up, that may be good news, but we don't know what the reason is. Maybe the economy has made such a growth in the STEM industries that could be a reason why more students are attracted to it. It could also be the other way around, that more students have now chosen to do STEM, and that has led to an increase in the economy. Without research, we don't know really what we're doing, and I think that's an important message for Australia, but for most countries. To finish off, I was recently interviewed by The Age about what I think of STEM education, and I highlight two quotes. I'm not sure if people in the back can read them, so I'll read them for you. The one that I highlight up here, is we need to think of how to best use teachers' expertise to help kids make sense of all the information they get anywhere for free and all the time, and make that information meaningful to them so that that becomes knowledge. And the second one, where is my... Schools are also there to help children make sense of the world that they grow up in, and that has to do with moral issues, which I think is very important with science and technologies, because it leads to questions like this: is this something that we really want? I'm saying here that not every student needs to pursue STEM. However, I do think it's important in the age of post-truth and fake news that we teach students to make sense of the information about STEM topics that impact on their lives. For instance, energy problems, global warming. What's true and what's myth? Help them make informed decisions. For instance, when they're a little bit older and they have to choose either an SUV or a Tesla car. And to provide them with informed foundation to talk about moral issues. Remember the discussion a few weeks ago about baby Charlie. You need knowledge, you need skills to make sense of that. And that's, I think, where STEM plays an important role. I look forward to work with many of you on STEM education in a way that it engages students and that it empowers teachers. Thank you very much.
I also have notes. They serve to keep my enthusiasm in check. Otherwise, I'll simply invite this man for yet another cup of coffee and we'll take this whole thing apart. But look, it's my job to move a vote of thanks, and I'm interpreting that pretty loosely as an invitation to celebrate the presentation we've just enjoyed. And during the presentation, Jan identified several key questions. Among them, the one that he pirated from Peter, What is it that STEM education could add or bring that innovations in science education have already failed to bring? What is the value addedness of STEM? And how can STEM education make a difference in Australia? Now, these are questions that matter. And Jan has offered us an answer that transcends the restrictions of science education. Now, at a time when educators and school systems are being exhorted to promote the meta-curriculum of disciplinary transcendent 21st century skills, the European New Skills Agenda, Jan's provided us with a vision of STEM as the vehicle of a much more nuanced version of this reform. And the image of research and design as interlinked practices provides an essential key, I think, to the curricular realisation of the interdisciplinarity that STEM could embody. Now, the illustration of how this can be and is being achieved through school programs like the one described in the Netherlands has to be a source of encouragement to us. Now, Jan has further directed our attention to what such curricular innovation is likely to require of teachers. And what's nice is, of course, the fundamental optimism of reform as a context for teacher learning rather than simply a problem for teacher learning is typical of the optimism that we've come to associate with Jan. Advocacy of a team-based approach to the teaching of the curriculum, of a curriculum that prioritises team-based design and problem solving, represents the ultimate educational coherence of medium and message. Now, our community is now significantly enriched by the addition of Professor Van Driel. And so the presentations like this are intended to provide food for thought, and Jan has really served us a feast. On your behalf, I'd like to thank him very much for an informative and inspiring presentation.